In 1788, a 23-year-old Irish naval captain was sailing through the Solomon Islands when his ship passed by an uncharted tropical island. On that island were smoke signals, desperate pleas for help rising into the sky. The captain saw them, he watched them, but he sailed on, dismissing them as a threat. What if he'd stopped? What if he'd investigated? What if he'd sent a rescue boat? Because on that island, survivors were waiting. Men who'd already endured shipwreck, starvation, and the massacres of their crewmates. Men who'd managed to stay alive for 3 years by sheer will alone. And one of them was one of history's greatest explorers. Today we're uncovering the mystery that haunted Louis XVI, even as he went to the guillotine, the disappearance of Comte de Lapérouse, and the narrow miss that could have changed everything. Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de Lapérouse, was born in 1741 in the French countryside near a city called Albi. From childhood, this man was destined for greatness, not through privilege alone, but through relentless ambition and tactical brilliance. By the time he was just 15 years old, Lapérouse had already enlisted in the French Navy. That's remarkable. While other teenagers were living ordinary lives, this young man was already at sea, learning navigation, strategy, and the art of command. He wasn't just sailing, he was observing, learning, preparing for something greater. During the American Revolutionary War, Lapérouse became a hero. In 1779, commanding the frigate Amazon, he captured an entire British warship. But his greatest moment came in 1782 when he led a daring raid on Hudson Bay, infiltrating British trading posts and capturing 2 massive fortifications. However, and this shows his character, he negotiated the release of prisoners in exchange for French captives back in England. He was ruthless, yes, but he was also humane. By 1785, King Louis XVI himself selected Lapérouse for the most prestigious mission of his life, to lead a grand expedition around the world. This wasn't just about exploration. This was about France asserting itself as a global power, competing with British explorers like Captain James Cook. France needed this, and Lapérouse was their man. On August 1st, 1785, Lapérouse set sail from Brest, France with 2 ships, La Boussole and L'Astrolabe. With him traveled 225 men, not just sailors, but 10 scientists, astronomers, botanists, geologists, naturalists, illustrators, and even chaplains who were educated in the sciences. This was the most sophisticated scientific expedition France had ever assembled. They sailed south around Cape Horn, one of the most treacherous passages on Earth, then east across the Pacific. Lapérouse reached Easter Island, discovering new lands, charting coastlines, collecting botanical specimens. He sailed to the Hawaiian Islands, becoming the first European to set foot on Maui. The expedition was groundbreaking, but then came disaster. In Alaska, at a place Lapérouse named Port des Français, now known as Lituya Bay, he sent 3 boats to explore inland. The bay has vicious, unpredictable currents. The barge and 2 longboats were caught. In the violent currents, all 3 boats were destroyed. 21 men gone, dead, drowned in those black waters. It was Lapérouse's first taste of the Pacific's cruelty. It wouldn't be his last. The expedition continued, now more cautious. They crossed the Pacific in just 100 days, an impressive feat. They explored the coasts of China, Japan, Korea. They became the first Europeans to map large sections of the Asian mainland. They were making history. Then came December 6, 1787. The Navigator Islands, today called Samoa. Everything seemed fine. The crew had made peaceful contact with the locals. They were gathering fresh water, taking on supplies. Standard procedure. But as the men were returning to the boats, something went wrong. The Samoans attacked with clubs and spears. It happened fast, chaotic, brutal. When it was over, 12 men lay dead, among them the geologist Robert de Lamennais. Among them, Paul-Antoine Fleuriot de Langle, the commander of L'Astrolabe, Lapérouse's second-in-command. 20 more men were wounded, critically. Lapérouse pressed on. He had to, but he was now down 2 ships' worth of leadership. Dozens of skilled men in his scientific team had been decimated. He was carrying grief and trauma across an indifferent ocean. On January 24, 1788, Lapérouse reached Botany Bay on the coast of Australia. There he encountered something unexpected, a British convoy led by Captain Arthur Phillip, establishing a penal colony. France and Britain were not at war at this moment. There was actually a cordial, almost friendly encounter. French and British officers visited each other's ships formally at least 11 times. They shared supplies. They exchanged information. It was one of those curious moments in history where enemies could be civil, even generous. Lapérouse spent 6 weeks there. He sent detailed journals, charts, and letters back to France aboard a British merchant ship. In his letter to the French ministry, he told them, "I expect to be back in France by June 1789. He wasn't going to make it. On March 10, 1788, Lapérouse's 2 ships set sail from Botany Bay bound for New Caledonia, Santa Cruz, the Solomon Islands, and the western coast of Australia. As they sailed away, Father Louis Receveur, the chaplain of L'Astrolabe, lay dying from injuries sustained in Samoa. He would die at Botany Bay and be buried on shore. Lapérouse and his crews were never seen again by Europeans. Imagine the waiting in France. Months passed, then a year. The king asked about Lapérouse. His wife never remarried. She waited, hoping. By 1790, it was clear something catastrophic had happened. But where? How? No one knew. France sent search expeditions. Admiral Bruni d'Entrecasteaux departed in 1791 with 2 ships specifically to find Lapérouse. In May 1793, they actually sighted an island called Vanikoro in the Solomon Islands, an island that hadn't been on any map before. But they didn't investigate. They sailed on, and Admiral Entrecasteaux died of scurvy before he could organize a proper search. Meanwhile, wild rumors spread across France. Some people whispered that the British had captured Lapérouse deliberately, that the friendly encounter at Botany Bay was a trap. During the French Revolution, this became a point of political rage, the theory that perfidious Britain had destroyed France's greatest explorer. But there was no evidence, no wreckage, no survivors, nothing. 30 years passed, 30 years of mystery. In 1826, almost 4 decades after Lapérouse vanished, an Irish sea captain named Peter Dillon was sailing in the Solomon Islands. He stopped at an island called Tikopia, and there he saw something extraordinary. European artifacts, swords with Paris engraved on the blades, medals, cups, silver utensils, glass beads. He questioned the islanders. They told him the items came from a nearby island, Vanikoro. They said that years ago, 2 large ships had wrecked there. Dillon was a merchant captain, not a naval officer, but he had the presence of mind to understand what he'd found. He managed to obtain a ship and sailed to Vanikoro, where he discovered anchors, cannonballs, and other remnants of European vessels scattered among the coral reefs. When he brought these artifacts back to France, an elderly man named Barthélemy de Lesseps identified them. De Lesseps had been an interpreter on Lapérouse's expedition. He'd left the expedition in Kamchatka to carry messages back to France, and he recognized these items immediately. They belonged to L'Astrolabe. Suddenly, 30 years of mystery began to unravel. The islanders of Vanikoro told Dillon their version of what had happened. It painted a picture of catastrophe. Here's what the islanders had witnessed and passed down through oral history. Lapérouse's 2 ships sailed toward Vanikoro on a voyage they expected to complete without incident. But Vanikoro is surrounded by treacherous coral reefs. And while the maps Lapérouse had were good, incredibly good, they weren't perfect. The island remained a hazard. What happened next came suddenly. La Boussole hit the reef first. The ship was torn apart on the jagged coral. The crew abandoned ship and scrambled to L'Astrolabe, but L'Astrolabe also found herself trapped on the reef. Now both ships were wrecked. Lapérouse had 450 men stranded on an island in the remote Pacific, with no means of rescue, no hope of recovery. The survivors salvaged what they could and established a small settlement on Vanikoro. They were alive. They had supplies. Perhaps they could survive long enough for rescue, but the local inhabitants of Vanikoro, they saw the European survivors as a threat, or perhaps as an opportunity. A violent clash erupted. The islanders attacked the European settlement. In the violence that followed, many of the survivors, possibly survivors of La Boussole, were massacred. The islanders told Dillon that Lapérouse and the remaining survivors were devastated but determined. They weren't broken. They worked together using salvage from L'Astrolabe, and they built a makeshift two-masted vessel, a small ship from wreckage. About 9 months after the wrecks, this jury-rigged ship sailed away from Vanikoro, heading west toward the Dutch East Indies. And then, nothing. The ship vanished as completely as the original expedition. What happened to it? Whether it was destroyed in a storm, captured by pirates, or sunk by accident, no one will ever know. The ocean kept its final secret, but here's where it gets heartbreaking. Remember that Irish captain I mentioned at the beginning? Captain Edwards, commanding HMS Pandora? In August of 1791, 3 years after Lapérouse had wrecked on Vanikoro, HMS Pandora was sailing through the Solomon Islands. Edwards was searching for mutineers from the HMS Bounty. His mission was single-minded, almost obsessive. Find the mutineers, ignore everything else. On August 13, 1791, as Pandora sailed near Vanikoro, lookouts spotted something. Smoke signals rising from the island, unmistakable, deliberate. Surely a distress call. But Edwards was convinced the signals were a trick, that the Bounty mutineers were trying to lure him into a trap. He ordered the ship to sail on. He ignored the signals. He sailed past. Later, historical research suggests those smoke signals were almost certainly from Lapérouse's survivors. Men who were still alive on Vanikoro, 3 years after the wrecks, still hoping for rescue. Captain Edwards sailed on. One historian, Sven Walrus, argues that Edwards was virtually certain to have been one of the heroes of maritime history, had he simply investigated, if he sent a boat ashore, if he spent a few hours investigating. Instead, Captain Edwards became a footnote, and the survivors of Lapérouse were left behind. It wasn't until 2005, over 200 years after the disaster, that a French Navy ship identified La Boussole on the ocean floor near Vanikoro. The wreck was formally confirmed. Scientists and historians finally had physical evidence of what the islanders had preserved in oral tradition all those centuries. 2 museums now hold artifacts from Lapérouse's expedition, one in Albi, France, his birthplace, one in New Caledonia. These objects tell the story of ambition, discovery, tragedy, and the terrible randomness of fate. The world remembers Lapérouse today. Mountains are named after him. Straits bear his name. Streets in Paris honor his memory. There's even a crater on the moon named Lapérouse. But it's the mystery of his final days that captures the imagination. Did any survivors make it off that makeshift ship? Did anyone reach the Dutch East Indies? Were there descendants who never knew their ancestor was part of that legendary voyage? We'll never know. The story of Lapérouse reminds us that history isn't always written in triumphant moments. Sometimes the greatest stories are told in the silences, in what we don't know, in the decisions not made, in the distress calls not answered. On January 21st, 1793, on the morning he went to the guillotine during the French Revolution, King Louis XVI asked one last question to those around him. Any news of Lapérouse? The answer was no, and it remains no to this day.